May 1944. Dover Strait, night. The sea is a black plate cut by moonlight, and the wind off the channel carries salt into every seam of cloth and every crack of concrete, beneath the chalk, behind steel doors and guarded corridors. The air changes colder, steadier, alive with electricity and breath. A man leans over a receiver in the wartime tunnels of Dover Castle, listening not for speech but for shape, a rhythm of clicks, a measured pulse of dots and dashes, a thin mechanical heartbeat that does not belong to any one soldier yet claims the weight of an army. The signal is not a confession. It is a performance. It is a sound built to be overheard. It is the sound of a nation learning that in war, you sometimes do not kill the enemy's men. You kill the enemy's certainty first. Outside, above ground, the coast of Kent is quiet in the way that only a staged quiet can be. Somewhere inland, fields and lanes hold shapes that resemble the preparation for an invasion vehicle parks, camps, stores, and yet within the darkness of that coastal strip, a second reality is being assembled from canvas, scaffolding, and disciplined imagination. Dummy landing craft built from tubes, wood, canvas, and empty 40-gallon barrels sit in places where a German pilot might later swear he saw them. English heritage lights flicker where real lights should never be shown. Radios transmit where real radios should remain silent. A ghost army learns to breathe. It matters because the war has reached the point where brute strength alone, men and metal and fuel, cannot guarantee the foothold that will decide the continent. By May 1944, the Allied enterprise in Britain has swollen into a vast concentration. Roughly 2,876,000 Allied troops gathered in southern England, preparing an armada of more than 4,000 ships and over 1,200 aircraft, an industrial tide waiting for a narrow window of weather and tide. U.S. National Archives Eisenhower note. It is the sort of accumulation that cannot be concealed by darkness because it is too large to hide. So the Allies choose another method. They will hide it by showing something else. The plan's name, Bodyguard, has a cold elegance to it, and it borrows its philosophy from a line often attributed to Churchill, that truth in wartime is so precious it must be attended by a bodyguard of lies. It is a line repeated because it is useful, because it explains what is about to happen in the simplest possible terms. Deception is not ornament, it is armor. The Allies do not merely want to land in Normandy. They want, in the first vital days, to keep German armored divisions from arriving there in time to crush the beachhead. They want German commanders to hesitate, to misread, to hold back. They want time. Fortitude is the most visible limb of that bodyguard in operation, built to persuade German intelligence that the main Allied blow will fall not on the Normandy coast, but at the Pass de Saya, where the English coast is closest to France and where the Strait of Dover is narrowest. BBC Culture. The logic is simple. The enemy already believes Calais is the likely crossing. Fortitude's task is not to invent a new fear, but to feed an existing one until it becomes immovable. The tool of persuasion is scale of rumor, scale of evidence, scale of repetition. The Allies create a formation that will never fight. The 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, a phantom built on paper and reinforced by signals, decoys, and human testimony. 1st U.S. Army Group, it is given an identity, a supposed location in southeast England, and an internal life that can be sensed by the enemy through the thin cracks of war, radio traffic, sightings, reports, administrative chatter. The simulated boredom of training, the simulated impatience of men who appear to be waiting for their moment. To make that phantom believable, it needs a face. It needs a commander whose reputation can reach across the channel like a shouted warning. And in the spring of 1944, the Allies placed George S. Patton in that role not because they want him to lead the first landing, but because they want him to be seen leading something. Patton is not merely an officer. He is a symbol of aggression, of speed, of American audacity. In the German mind, he has already become a particular kind of problem. The commander you do not want to face when your line is thin and your reserves are slow. Hoover Institution. This is where the title's cold truth settles in. Using Patton as bait was not a poetic phrase. It was an active strategic theater. A man becomes a lure. A reputation becomes a weapon. And the order behind it, accepted, refined, insisted upon, asks senior commanders to trust that a lie could save lives in the most literal sense. The deception is not only paper and radio, it is also physical craft, a collaboration between military necessity and the practical genius of builders and artists. Dummy equipment appears vehicles and gear made to be seen from above, to be photographed, to be misunderstood. The Imperial War Museums preserve the memory of these objects, including inflatable vehicles and deception material that existed to be mistaken for real strength. IWM on nights when the wind is right. The Allies even dropped dummy parachutists, parachuting dummies meant to suggest airborne assaults where none are intended, drawing German attention and fire into emptiness. IWM, yet the most enduring piece of fortitude is not canvas or rubber. It is not even Patton's name. It is the story that runs beneath all of it. The story told directly into German ears through the most intimate channel of intelligence, the agent report. This is where the war becomes a contest not just of armies, but of credibility. Britain's double-cross system, known as the XX system turns, captured enemy agents into instruments of controlled misinformation. Double-cross system. It is not improvisation. It is administration. It is committees and case officers and files, and the careful calculation of what the enemy must be allowed to believe. The method is painfully patient. A double agent must not only lie, he must lie in a way that sounds like the truth, and sometimes he must tell small truths to preserve the shape of honesty. Trust is not demanded. It is cultivated. Among these agents, one becomes central to the fortitude story. Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, MI5, his background is almost designed to be underestimated. Spanish, anti-fascist, a man who had moved through Europe where ideology demanded loyalty and punished hesitation. He constructs what appears to German intelligence as a living network, 27 fictitious sub-agents, a fabricated community of observers and informants that can see, report, and interpret the supposed preparations in Britain. He writes at scale 315 letters, averaging about 2,000 words each, building consistency through detail. He and his handlers create not merely information, but a world. From January 1944 to D-Day, Garbo's operation expands into a tempo that resembles the machinery of war itself. Reports, transmissions, confirmations. In the sources you provided, it is described as over 500 radio messages during that period, sometimes 4 transmissions a day, enough to give German analysts the feeling that they are not chasing shadows but reading the routine outputs of a genuine clandestine network. MI5, the genius of the deception is that it matches the enemy's expectations. German planners already see the Pas de Calais as the natural crossing. Fortitude, supported by double-cross, feeds them the evidence they crave. The build-up in southeast England, the presence of a powerful American formation, the implied timetable. It tells them what they already fear, and it tells them with the rhythm of bureaucracy, with the dull reliability of reports that arrive on time. In the tunnels of Dover Castle, the war's strangest music continues. Signals operators generate a life for an army that does not exist. English heritage. This is not merely noise. It is structured chatter, training messages, logistical signals, order of battle hints, the kind of language that soldiers use when they are waiting for the day they will stop training and start killing. For the German listener, it becomes proof. It becomes comfort, in a perverse way comfort that the enemy is legible. Comfort that the war is still comprehensible. And this is what German soldiers and officers often expect, that the enemy's power can be measured, that a threat can be plotted on a map and placed in a neat rectangle. They expect the Allies to behave according to rational geography, to strike where distance is shortest, where ports can be seized quickly, where reinforcements can flow. In their minds, the Pas de Calais is the logical wound point, and logic feels like safety. If you can predict the enemy's logic, you can build your defenses like a wall. What they actually experience in June 1944 is the collapse of that comfort. The invasion comes not at the narrowest crossing, but at Normandy, an assault that initially looks to many German planners like a diversion, and the mind clings to the pre-existing story, because abandoning it means admitting that the enemy has outgrown your assumptions. On the Allied side, the pressure of decision tightens. Weather, tides, and the reality of human fear compress into a few hours in early June. Eisenhower, in that hinge moment, writes the brief note accepting responsibility. If the landings fail, a short, stark piece of leadership that contains none of the romance of war, only accountability. U.S. National Archives, Eisenhower note. The invasion proceeds. On 6 June 1944, the assault falls across roughly a 50-mile stretch of coast, and about 160,000 Allied soldiers land that day. In the hours of darkness preceding it, over 18,000 paratroopers drop American 82nd and 101st Airborne and the British 6th Airborne, casting the opening dice in hedgerows, flooded fields, and the black corridors of Norman night. These numbers matter because they show the scale of reality behind the deception. The lie is not a substitute for power. It is a method of directing how the enemy reacts to power. Even as men fight on the beaches, the Ghost Army must continue to live. If the Germans conclude immediately that Normandy is the main blow, the deception fails in the one way that matters most. German reserves surge toward the real battle, and so fortitude continues after D-Day. The story persists. Normandy is the first act, not the climax. The main strike is still coming. Patton still waits in England. Fuzak still trains. The Palme de Calais remains threatened. Here, the double-cross system becomes more than prelude. It becomes a sustaining engine. Garbo's communications, including the critical post-day reporting, help to hold German belief in the Calais narrative. Sources in your research set emphasize a major message on 9 June 1944, D-Day +3, that served the deception's purpose by framing Normandy as a diversion and reinforcing the expectation of the real landing at Calais. MI5. And across the Channel, German command structures struggle with competing imperatives. They must respond to the fact of Normandy while guarding against the feared second landing. To the German soldier in the field, this becomes a particular cruelty. You are asked to hold ground against an enemy who seems to have endless supplies, while your own strategic reserves sit elsewhere, waiting for a blow that never comes. It is not merely a military problem. It is an emotional one. The soldier sees the front bleeding and wonders why the bandages are kept in a locked cabinet on another coast. The deception's physical elements continue to feed that confusion. Dummy craft and staged activity along the eastern and southeastern coasts suggest embarkation and rehearsal. English Heritage, the BBC's account of fortitude, emphasizes this army that didn't exist. A phantom built to be plausible enough that German decision-makers would not risk being wrong by moving too soon. BBC culture, the result, as framed in your supplied material, is delay that cannot be measured in poetry, but can be measured in days. Major Richard G. Ricklefs, writing on Fortitude South, notes evidence of its success in Hitler's reaction. His fear of an attack at Passa de Cala was such that the German 15th Army there was only permitted to partially redeploy to Normandy on 28 July, far too late to have decisive impact on the battle. Army University Press, that date 28 July matters because it speaks to the endurance of belief. It is one thing to fool an enemy on a single night. It is another to shape his posture for weeks while he watches your real offensive unfold elsewhere. Fortitude is often described as startling in its success, but its deeper achievement is more subtle. It turns German caution into a weapon against itself. In the Calais region, German forces remain fixed, waiting for Patton. In Normandy, Allied soldiers fight through hedgerows, where every field becomes a miniature fortress. The Germans, expecting a clean logic of landing sites and decisive blows, encounter something else. A democracy's capacity for sustained pressure, for mass, for replacement, for relentless logistics. The American abundance that is often symbolized by food or fuel is here symbolized by something less romantic but more decisive. Radio discipline and production. The industrial hum behind every unit, the endless ability to coordinate. The clipped pulse becomes the symbol of that abundance, not a meal, not a weapon, but the sound of a system that can create reality and illusion simultaneously. This is where Patton's role becomes most paradoxical. The man known for speed and aggression is held back, turned into a signpost rather than a spear. He is visible, but withheld. A commander becomes a rumor with boots. The German view of Patton, examined in retrospective assessments, shows why this mattered. German officers did not merely fear American equipment. They feared operational tempo, the sense that Patton could move faster than their bureaucratic reactions. Hoover Institution fortitude exploited that fear. It did not need Patton to be attacking. It needed the Germans to believe he could. The deception's machinery is not limited to Garbo. The double-cross system employed numerous agents' code names that sound like characters in a novel because, in some ways, they were used as characters in a carefully written plot. Tricly, Torischer, Beatrice, Zigzag, and others. The existence of this network managed through MI5's counter-espionage discipline and the 20 Committee's oversight is part of why Fortitude could be sustained without cracking. MI5 double-cross system. But Garbo becomes the emblem because his case contains the war's bitter irony. He's rewarded by both sides. In the summer of 1944, as Normandy becomes an undeniable battle and yet Calais remains guarded, German authorities choose to honor the agent whose reports have helped keep their eyes fixed on the wrong coast. On 29 July 1944, Hitler awards Garbo the Iron Cross for what German authorities believe are extraordinary services. MI5. It is an award meant for bravery, for loyalty, for contribution to German victory. In Garbo's hands it becomes something else, proof that the enemy's system of honor can be manipulated by a story well told. There is no public parade for this award. No German band, no cheering crowd. The ceremony is conducted in distance, through messages and recognition, because Garbo is not in Berlin and cannot stand in a hall beneath banners. Yet the effect is ceremonial all the same. A regime that worships obedience pins symbolic metal onto a man who has built an entire world of disobedience in ink and radio waves. The irony is not merely personal. It is strategic. It demonstrates that German decision-making has become trapped inside its own narrative. It is praising the very mechanism that is strangling its capacity to respond. The Allies, meanwhile, continue to use the Phantom. Fortitude's post-day phase. The continued Calais deception keeps the specter alive long enough to matter. The enemy must be kept uncertain not for hours but for weeks, not for a single landing but for the entire fragile process of turning a beachhead into a front. The BBC's account emphasizes the persistence of German belief in the Phantom Army, even after the landings. BBC culture as July passes into August. The war's reality begins to overwhelm even the most carefully maintained illusions. Normandy is no longer a raid. It is a campaign, and yet the delay has done its work. The initial Allied foothold, so vulnerable on 6 June, has survived long enough to harden. The deception has purchased time, and time, in war, is often more valuable than any single piece of equipment. Later, the recognition of Garbo by Britain completes the circle. In December 1944, Juan Puyol Garcia receives an MBE, presented under British authority, with MI5's Director General Sir David Petrie associated with the honor in the material you provided. MI5. This too is a ceremony of paradox. Britain does not celebrate him with brass bands either. It honors him in the quiet way intelligence services tend to honor their best instruments through formal recognition that cannot fully describe what was done. The public cannot be told every detail. The war, even near its end, still requires some secrets to remain sealed. And so the man who invented 27 people, who wrote hundreds of messages, who fed the German fear of Calais until it became a prison, becomes one of the few individuals to hold both the Iron Cross and a British order. It is not a triumph of ideology. It is a triumph of method. It is proof that in modern war, narrative can be a battlefield, and credibility can be a weapon. In the end, the strategic assessment must be colder than legend. Fortitude did not win the war alone. The Allied victory in Normandy depended on air superiority, naval power, logistics, and the courage of men who crossed beaches under fire. Yet deception shaped the conditions under which those strengths could operate. Fortitude and the double-cross system did not create Allied power. They shaped German response to Allied power. They turned German caution into inertia. The evidence presented in your supplied sources points to that inertia's operational consequence, Hitler's fixation on Pas de Calais and the delayed freedom of movement for the 15th Army, only partially permitted to redeploy on 28 July, too late to rewrite the outcome of the initial Normandy struggle. Army University Press, that delay is the strategic dividend. Not a miracle, not a myth, a measurable narrowing of German options during the weeks when a beachhead could have been strangled. It is also a moral lesson as uncomfortable as it is useful. Democracies often want war to be simple, good and evil, courage and cowardice, victory and defeat. Fortitude reminds us that war also involves deception conducted with administrative calm files, committees, dummycraft, signals units, fabricated reports. It reminds us that truth in war is not always the first tool used to defend the lives of soldiers. Sometimes truth is guarded, hidden, delayed, attended by lies so that the truth can survive long enough to matter. For the German soldiers stationed near Calais, the experience is a kind of betrayal by geography. He is told the decisive moment is coming where the sea is narrow. He waits through long days and longer nights, watching the water, staring at the gray line of England, believing that somewhere beyond that horizon a hammer is being lifted. He expects a clean strike. He expects to be tested by the enemy's main force. Instead, he becomes part of a silent failure held in place by belief, while the real battle drains the army elsewhere. The expected thunder never arrives. The actual thunder comes from Normandy, and by the time the truth is undeniable, the opportunity to crush it has passed. For the Allied soldier in Normandy, the contrast is different. He expects that the enemy will throw everything at him. He braces for the armored counterstroke that will roll him back into the sea, and in the earliest days, that counterstroke is slower than fear, delayed by uncertainty, diluted by the enemy's need to guard against a second landing. The soldier does not hear Fortitude's radio pulse. He hears gunfire and the crash of shells, but somewhere behind him, hidden in tunnels and radio huts and offices, the pulse continues, buying him hours, then days, then weeks. That is the transformation at the center of this story. The war changes how leaders understand power. It is not enough to assemble armies. You must shape how the enemy perceives them. You must anticipate not only his weapons, but his assumptions. Patton, baited and displayed, becomes a lesson in reputational warfare. Garbo becomes a lesson in narrative warfare, and Fortitude becomes a lesson in institutional warfare. The ability of a democracy to coordinate deception across services and nations, to sustain a fiction with discipline, and to do so without losing sight of the brutal reality that fiction is meant to protect. When the war finally moves beyond Normandy, when the front advances and the maps change, the phantom army dissolves into the paperwork from which it was born. The dummy craft are no longer needed. The radios fall silent or turn to other tasks. The pulse becomes just another signal in a world filled with signals. Yet the sound remains as a metaphor, and it is here, at the end, that the story returns to Dover. The tunnels are still cold. The sea still moves in darkness outside. In that place, one can imagine the radio operator again, hands steady, eyes tired, transmitting the life of a force that does not exist. The clipped pulse is not merely a trick. It is the sound of organization, of patience, of a society that can turn factories and studios and signal schools into instruments of survival. It is the sound of abundance, not as excess, but as capacity, the capacity to build, to coordinate, to improvise, to sustain effort beyond the enemy's endurance. And perhaps that is the larger truth Fortitude reveals about freedom and ideology. Dictatorships often demand certainty. They punish doubt. They reward obedience to a single narrative. Deception works against them because it feeds that hunger for certainty with false nourishment. Democracies, messier and louder, can tolerate uncertainty long enough to weaponize it. They can build a story not because they worship the story, but because they understand it as a tool, temporary, instrumental, designed to protect lives until the real strength can be applied. In the end, the war's greatest lies do not erase the war's greatest truths. They escort them,